pattern for children, but I think adults can have cute stuff too. In my previous video, I showed everyone how to make a petal hat that looks like this. And I also came across this vintage simplicity pattern illustration that I really like a lot. I printed this off the internet and I don't have the pattern for this actually, but I thought I could really easily hack this pattern and recreate this look. I was tossing between the blue and the yellow version, but I've actually got a gingham yellow fabric lying around. And I also have a lot of clothes that's suitable for spring and summer that's already in the same kind of color scheme. Orange, yellow, green. Orange, yellow, green. So I thought I would make the yellow version instead. So in this video, I am going to be showing you how to take a piece of paper, draft your own pattern, and hopefully make a hat that looks like this. A retro 60s inspired hat. So let's get started, and if you think you prefer not to have this retro version, you can hop back to my previous video and learn how to make the basic petal hat. It is a reversible hat, so you can actually play around with the different fabric scraps that you have at home. And if not, we'll get started on the retro daisy version of it.
For this retro 60s version of the petal hat, I decided to draft my own pattern from scratch instead of using the free pattern from Dr. Cost's site. If you're thinking about making this hat, you can find the link to the free pattern by Dr. Cost, as well as the link to my drafting tutorial in the description box. After drafting the basic petal hat pattern in my size, I made adjustments to the pattern from my 60s inspired version before adding the seam allowance to the pattern. To create the scalloped edge look for the 60s hat, I drew a semicircle in the bottom of the pattern. And to do that, I marked out 1.5 inches from the bottom for both the left and right edges of the pattern with the cross. Then I marked out a cross at the bottom point where the bottom of the pattern and the center of the pattern meet, over here. And finally, I connected all these crosses together to make a semicircle pattern. I had to draw the curve a couple of times to make sure that both sides look the same, but if you're having difficulties with that, you can simply fold the pattern along the center line in half and then just mirror the drawing in that manner. So once I was satisfied with how the pattern looked, I added my 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance to the pattern. Don't forget to also label your paper pattern so you can always go back to it and remember exactly what the pattern is supposed to be. For this project, I'm using a quilting weight cotton. Before cutting the fabric, I pressed the fabric to remove any wrinkles that it has from storage, and when cutting the fabric, I alternated the direction of the pattern to try to tessellate the pattern so that I could minimize fabric waste. So for reference, this is how my 1 yard of fabric looks after cutting all the pieces for sewing the hat. And just like I did in the original petal hat tutorial, I applied interfacing to the lining pieces of the hat to give the hat more structure. The first few steps to sewing the hat together is the same as the original petal hat tutorial. Basically, I started off by sewing 2 pieces together and then went on to sew a 3rd piece to each pair that I've sewn. And at the end, I got 4 halves of the hat, each made up of 3 pieces of the original hat pattern stitched together in a fan-like manner. 2 halves will make up the main side of the hat, and the other 2 halves will make up the lining side of the hat. And then at this stage, I'm going to do something that's quite uncharacteristic of me. I'm going to press the seams so that it's going to be nice and neat when I sew them all together. I used my steam iron to press the seams open. And because the top of the hat has more of a curved seam, I used my tailor's ham to help me with it. After pressing the seams open, I felt really fancy and decided to top stitch on both sides of each seam as well. And this is how it looks at the top where both seams meet.
Cool. We're making some progress with the hat, and I'm really liking the top stitching details. It's gonna really look professional and done. Before I actually put 2 halves together to make a hat, I'm gonna be making the straps that go under the chinny chin chin over here. I reckon the strap will go this long, and then maybe I'll have this much to make that little ribbon tie, butterfly tie thing. So it's gonna be about this long, 15 inches, and I'm just gonna add maybe 1 inch for good measure. 16. I always like an even number anyway. So 16 inches. I'm gonna make 2 straps that's 16 inches long. 2 straps that are 16 inches long and half an inch wide.
And to make the ties for the hat, I cut 2 rectangular strips of fabric, each measuring about 16 inches by 1.75 inches. Then I folded each strip in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, and stitched with a 3/8 inch seam allowance along the long side and 1 short side of the tie. And I wish I could tell you some super cool trick to turn the tie inside out with a safety pin, but honestly I didn't think and plan ahead when sewing the ties, so I ended up with quite a bit of difficulty. And yeah, no super awesome trick here, just a safety pin, a lot of patience, and a little bit of brute force this time. After turning the ties inside out, I pressed it flat with a steam iron and added edge stitching along the edges with the seam. Okay, so at first I thought I was going to sew the ties between the halves of the lining of the hat, but then I changed my mind about it, so here I am continuing to put the hat together according to the original paddle hat tutorial. Basically, I pinned the 2 halves of the lining together, stitched them with the 3/8 seam allowance, and then did the same for the main hat pieces. And since I did top stitching for all the seams for the hat so far, I decided to do the same for this seam as well. And here is how the point where all the seams intersect look. And then it was time to sew the ties to the lining of the hat. To do that, I took one of the ties, placed the end with the raw edge on one of the seams of the hat, and then folded it down by half an inch. The placement of this bit where I'm going to be sewing down is about 1 inch from the bottom edge of the hat. I did the same for the other tie, and I made sure that the other tie is actually resting on another seam that is directly opposite to the first tie. There is no fancy technique involved in sewing the tie onto the lining of the hat. I started off at one corner, and then I just went around and kind of made a square pattern. It's about ½ an inch wide, and this helps to secure the tie on the lining, and it also helps to hide the raw edge that's on the underside of the tie. After that, I continued to sew the main and lining pieces together, just like the original paddle hat tutorial. I also pricked my finger in the process of pinning them right sides together, so this is just a cautionary tale for you. Be careful when you're working with sharp objects, okay? Because it's not fun to prick yourself. When sewing the dips between each semicircle of the scalloped edge, I made sure that I pivoted the hat and made about 2 to 3 horizontal stitches. In my experience, this helps to make the dips turn out flatter and nicer because there's so much bulk that's along the seams where the dips are. I decided to use 2 to 3 horizontal stitches instead of just one, which is what I have done before for other projects like my hacked burnside bibs. Before turning the hat inside out, I clipped the scalloped edge and I paid special attention to the dips between the semicircles. Again, this is important for helping the curve turn out nice and smooth. I finished the rest of the hat just like the original paddle hat tutorial, hand sewing the opening close and then rolling the seam flat with my fingers, and finally top stitching the bottom edge of the hat.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the illustration again just to think about how I'm going to be placing the flowers on the hat. I'm going to need a flower at the top, and then I'm going to have 2 ribbons hanging off, and then I'm going to have flowers hanging off the end of those strands of ribbon.
To add the daisy design, I started by cutting 2 pieces of ribbon that's about 2 inches longer than the length of the hat. Then I cut off all the 5 daisies on this miserable stalk that I bought from eBay. The daisy petals were kind of folding in weird directions, so I fixed that by blowing the hairdryer on it while letting the petals lay flat on a table, and that worked. And because I wanted to hide the ugly plastic underside of the daisies, I used a coin and a pair of pinking scissors to help me trace and cut out little fabric circles in the same yellow gingham fabric as the hat. When it came to sticking the fabric circles onto the back of the daisies, I had so much difficulty I almost gave up. Here's the story. I wanted to get a hot glue gun from Michael's on the same day that I bought the yellow ribbon, but my husband thought maybe Lowe's would have a better selection of glue gun that is of a better quality. But when we got to Lowe's, we found out that the hot glue guns were about at least $12 each, and I'm like, I'm not spending that kind of money on a hot glue gun. So I said, no, I'm not buying a hot glue gun here, and we ended up getting this fabric glue that I thought would work, but it stings and it takes about 24 hours to cure and at least 2 hours to dry. So I actually gave up on this glue and went back to Michael's at the next convenient day and finally got my hot glue gun, hot glue sticks, and I'm now ready for DIYing everything. I glued 2 daisies back to back on each end of the ribbon, and then I took the 2 free ends of the ribbon and glued them onto the back of the 5th daisy. And then I put another fabric circle over the ribbons again just to give it like a clean finish. And finally, I glued the strands of daisy on the top of the hat with the hot glue gun as well. And just like before, because the top of the hat has a bit more curve, I used a tailor's ham to help me make sure that I've got the daisy stuck really well on the top of the hat. And then I was finally finished! Here's how my retro 60s hat looked. So I hope you've enjoyed this little video of me talking and walking through the process of hacking the original paddle hat pattern and recreating this retro 60s style. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos in the future, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!
Patterns there for kids, and I don't know why. That was my dog. Sorry.